big issue. But what about if we're talking about seasonal timescales? Okay, what are the options there? Because can we really store a seasonal amount of energy and shift it to other parts of times of the day? So this is kind of an example from the UK where they looked at kind of the seasonal mismatch essentially between domestic demand, well, I think it was national demand and supply, with assuming that they're getting this growth in solar and wind supply, but also that they're electrifying heat. So in the UK, there's a lot of gas used for heating. Okay, so if you move to electric heating, heat pumps, for example, then you're going to get this increase in demand, and you kind of see it here. So if you look at this 2015, 20 up to 2030, you can see this increase in winter demand in all those across those years, and then you're trying to. This also shows kind of scenarios of increasing solar, trying to meet that demand, increasing wind. Now, the trouble with the solar generation is it's not aligned with your demand. You're getting peaks in winter, but the solar is providing it in summer, and so your variation between summer, so in summer and winter becomes even larger. So even though their growth is growing, their summer demand stays more or less the same. It's just their winter demand that grows. Now, wind's a lot better. Wind in the UK looks like it matches demand a lot better. Okay, but still there's that quite significant mismatch. So what about New Zealand? So this is some scenarios that have created by the Electricity Authority. They just took a bunch of weather stations around New Zealand, and they looked at solar and wind and the kind of histogram of these the kind of supply from those locations for wind and solar. And you can see the top lines are summer, and so you're getting quite you're getting sometimes when you're getting quite a high generation of megawatts, right? But that drops off significantly in winter in both the cases of wind and solar. So basically they're saying wind is in New Zealand, wind is better in summer, and so is solar, and wind is not. So it's kind of inverse from the UK. So we're getting more wind supply in summer. So I don't know how. I mean, this was taking all weather stations across New Zealand, so it may, there may be differences in key locations, but it seems to suggest that wind is not going to help us with winter peaks. So let's have a look at the seasonal mismatch in New Zealand. So that's our national electricity demand up there. And I've just put a number in there. 0.8 terawatt hours is the kind of the distance between the peak and the trough of that sort of monthly demand. And a kind of a good a way to sort of quantify that kind of mismatch between summer and winter is kind of the area of that peak, which is around about 23 terawatt hours. So if you if you were to say, okay, let's meet that peak somehow, and the moment we meet it with hydro, right? But let's say we don't have that hydro available because we've increased our demand significantly. What do we do? And people have talked a lot about the dry year problem in New Zealand. I don't know if you've heard it, but it's essentially what if we don't have enough? What if we don't have enough rainfall? And the hydro lakes don't fill up, and we can't sort of meet that. Hydro is not available to meet that peak. And so this is kind of the idea behind this big battery project that you probably heard about. Let's create a very, very large storage system. And Lake Onslow was the proposed case where we basically store enough that we can shift our summer supply into winter. That's kind of idea behind the project. There's a whole lot of other ways in which you could do this. You could overbuild. So that was a little bit like the case I showed you in South Australia, where you've actually got more solar than you need. So you could overbuild. So you could ensure that you had enough for your winter peak, and then just throw away, I guess, energy in summer. But this is all of these solutions are kind of costly. So are there sort of better ways? And it's interesting when you kind of think about this from a demand type of perspective, and what's underpinning this demand. Where does this demand actually come from? And if you look at the residential electric heating demand, it's around 70% of that winter peak. Okay, so domestic electrical heating demand is causing our peak, largely speaking. So, there are things we can do about that. And so we looked at some scenarios of kind of future residential space heating scenarios. So we looked at just continuing with the current New Zealand building code, going to a very, very high standard of housing, and looking out to 2050, where we basically built to very high standard, but we also had this really aggressive retrofit program to try and retrofit our current houses. On top of that, we also added in solar generation scenarios. So a lot of the discussion in the kind of building sector, especially in the European Union, is to move on from very, very efficient buildings and to go net zero buildings. And net zero buildings, they almost always mean solar. So what's net zero? Net zero is when you, on an annual basis, you look at your energy demand and you see that it's kind of zero, okay? And that means, if you were in a cold climate, that you're generating more solar in summer than winter, okay? So that's an interesting scenario to look at as well, to kind of explore the seasonal impact. So here are the results. So this is the net demand in 2050 from those building scenarios. The green dotted line here is the current demand, okay? And so if we built to the building code, the little triangles there, if we built to the building code without any solar, then because of that increase, so the other thing I didn't say is in our scenarios, we ensured that houses were heated to healthy temperatures. So we assumed that they were heated to 18 degrees in these scenarios, because why would you run a scenario of not heating to healthy temperatures? Why would you look at a future like that? What's the point? And so the triangles here show you the increase in demand that would occur if we built to the current building code. The blue triangles tell you if we built to this very high performance standard. So basically, you don't increase your winter peak, you slightly increase your summer peak, because this is what you're doing here is there are more houses, there's significantly more demand, both because you're heating houses to healthy temperatures and you're heating them to healthy temperatures. But you've basically not increased your demand in summer. Now, in winter. Now, when you add solar to this, so those are the pluses, you can see that actually you bring down your demand everywhere, even in winter, but you've increased that kind of variability in your demand. And just looking at it a bit more detail, this is just the very efficient house with solar, and without solar, and with two different types of solar, one with shallow tilts and one with solar at very steep tilts. So with a steep tilt case, you don't increase that variation as much, which is to be expected. So just kind of to emphasize this point then, what I've shown here is across the top, this is the building code, a very high performance standard and no solar, high solar. So if you look at, for example, the annual demand, you can see that the case where you have very high performance buildings, it's kind of similar to the case where you have the building code, but a lot of solar, okay? Because the solar is making up for that variation. But then if you look at the seasonal variation in those two cases, you can see that there's this significant difference because of the solar contribution. And even when you look at the seasonal variation of the kind of building to the high standard and then adding solar, you can see that as soon as you add solar, you get that significant seasonal variation. Okay, so that's an example where efficiency is actually playing a role in fixing this supply-demand mismatch. So it's kind of contradicting what I said was the most important, but I kind of want to emphasize these timescales are really important. So we can do the same thing for lighting. So from that green grid data that I talked to you about before, we could look and see when lighting was occurring, okay? So we took that data and we extrapolated across New Zealand and looked at what would happen if you moved to energy efficient lighting. So these are just scenarios of progressively going towards much more efficient lighting and seeing what impact that will have on peaks. And you can see energy efficiency is not decoupled from the problems that I was telling you about. Sometimes it has a real beneficial effect in terms of reducing peaks, and that's quite significant. That's just lighting. Often we kind of think of lighting as being kind of a small effect, and it is a small part of our total energy use, but it's used during peaks. So you can continue to play these games. So we also looked at electrical vehicles. So electrical vehicles are interesting because if you think about an internal combustion engine, there is so much waste heat in an internal combustion engine that you have an oversupply of heat for heating the cabin. There's no problem heating the cabin in winter because you've got this excess, sort of more than 80% of your energy from the fuel is turned into heat. So you can heat the cabin, no problem at all. No one worries about heating their vehicle in an internal combustion engine. However, with an electric vehicle, you actually need to supply that heating energy because it's so efficient. You need to supply that heating energy mainly from the battery itself. So that's going to reduce your range. It's going to reduce the amount it's going to increase the amount of energy you need per kilometer, right? And so we took data from Flip the Fleet, which is so Flip the Fleet provided us with data on 1,000 vehicles that they are monitoring. So Flip the Fleet is a citizen science organization. They provided us with monthly consumption data on the vehicles in that they're monitoring. And we built a statistical model to look at, what is this variation in energy intensity by season, okay? And so this is just an example, and it shows you the impact of energy efficiency again. So there were two Leaf models that came out, one without a heat pump, and then later models with a heat pump. And these are the consumption otherwise the models were prety similar. So this is how their consumption changes, the energy intensity, their watt hours per kilometer as you go through the winter months. I can't remember what location this is. Maybe it's an average, but you can see that there is the significant increase, 25% increase in demand during winter for every kilometer traveled for for those leaves without a heat pump. When you have a heat pump, more efficient, and so you reduce your energy use. And so we came up with a model of what a future fleet might look like, based around kind of the sort of vehicle, internal combustion vehicles we buy at the moment, a lot of SUVs, for example. And then we looked out to 2050, given some sort of growth of electric vehicles, what would what would that EV demand look like over the seasons? And you can see some of the results there. In Auckland, mild climate, not very much change in seasons, whereas you get to sort of Central Otago and you can get a significant change. The error bars around these were, because we don't really know what future models are going to look like, that was kind of the spread that we got from the data for the models that we had in our data set. And so, you know, kind of anything can happen really in the future around what sort of vehicles and how efficient they're going to do their heating, etc. Okay, so I'm going to summarize there. And so, you know, kind of what I wanted to get across in this talk was that, you know, these future highly renewable electricity systems often require new paradigms and new ways of thinking. So that, you know, that idea of, you know, efficiency just not being important. I mean, for us working in energy, you know, that's our bread and butter. That's what we think about all the time. But when you have a renewable supply, you can get these periods of pure abundance and supply, and that just, you know, changes your way of thinking, I think, about energy systems. And that's just one example. I didn't talk today about the distributed nature of renewable energy, which is another very different concept that kind of changes the way you think about energy supply and demand. Yeah, so energy becomes relevant at those times. So demand flexibility is really important. So the ability to shift demand at other times is critical to integrating these renewables on daily timescales, and it's really the cheapest method of doing it. There are other ways, you know, as I said, you can overbuild, but that requires infrastructure. And the interesting thing about renewable electricity systems is they're not greenhouse gas free. All the infrastructure costs, all the infrastructure has greenhouse gases embodied in it. And so it's not like that, that doesn't cause greenhouse gas emissions if you overbuild. There's significant greenhouse gas emissions. So I've got a PhD student actually working on an LCA of the electricity system. And the other thing I just wanted to make, for that seasonal or longer variation, efficiency then becomes critical again. And I like to call it targeted efficiency. So there's anything that reduces winter peaks is kind of important. Summer, maybe not so. I mean, maybe we're going to have plentiful supply in summer. Maybe cooling is not a problem because we have plentiful supply. And so I'd just like to end by sort of just kind of acknowledging like the huge bunch of people that I've worked with over the last few years on these topics. It's been really kind of a fun and interesting ride. And I kind of just want to kind of especially point out Ben Anderson. So Ben Anderson passed away earlier this year, and Ben was really instrumental in a lot of the thinking around kind of this work we were doing. He played a huge role in the green grid electricity data that I've showed you. And I remember sitting around the table with Janet at one stage where we this idea of home heating and peaks in winter came up, and yeah, so I yeah, just like to acknowledge Ben. And yeah, and thank you all. And if there's any questions.
Yeah, I've been wondering what research has been done around if we maximise the storage capacity of the hydro rather than as it is now, they maximise the profits. You know, if you really use that and you did your renewables to use as much as you can, so the dams just sat there full the whole time until you need it. You know, what would we then do?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question, because we actually some other work that I didn't talk about here was that I did with Janet was looking at the greenhouse gas emissions, how they vary in time, given the way in which our energy mix works. And if you look at it, I mean, at the time, everyone kind of internationally was saying peaks are expensive, peak demand, when you get really high demand, there's a lot of greenhouse gas emissions associated with those. So this was kind of the story internationally. And it may be so. I mean, maybe in a lot of places they're using peaking gas and coal plants to meet those peaks. But if you look at the New Zealand situation, that's not true at all. We're using hydro to meet the peaks. So the peaks weren't any more greenhouse gas intensive than otherwise. And kind of my point here is that we were still running coal at those times. So we were using coal as a base load, if that makes sense. So it's not like we were optimizing greenhouse gas emissions. We weren't saying, okay, we're only going to use coal if we absolutely need it. We were using it as a base load. So this is your point, that we're not actually optimizing hydro in order to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions.
For the short term, we can use batteries for the day-to-day, and also electric cars being that. So we can cover that. It's the longer term, it's the winter.
Right. Yeah.
And
so there are kind of quite strong limitations on the hydro dams in terms of they do need to kind of ecological considerations. That mean
just one other.
I think it's looked in detail a lot. What the limitations are.
I was going to leap in because Jean's not here, but I'm sure she would leap in and say, actually, the hydro dams, although they look huge, contain only, I think, 12 days worth of New Zealand's electricity supply. It's not a lot.
12 days is if there was no wind and sun, it wouldn't be more than 12 days. That's really quite a big bit of energy.
It's a little bit helpful, but yeah, you wouldn't want to run your dams right down to the bottom for ecological reasons.
Yeah, some online.
Question online. Yeah, Ronnie Cooper is asking about. You talked a lot about the winter peaks, but what are the future implications around summer peaks and the need for cooling?
Yeah, and I guess that was sort of, I mean, in our scenarios for house heating, when we looked into the future, you do see that actually Auckland, there are periods of time when there probably would be cooling. You know, if people had heat pumps installed to cool. I guess I'm less worried about it just because you have plentiful supply in summer, so solar is there that can provide that. So I guess that's an example where I would say its efficiency is important, but kind of not as critical, I guess, as the winter. Yes.
Bibi, do you want to ask your question? I see you've got your hand
up. Thanks, Michael. That was really interesting. I think a couple of things stood out to me. One in particular was the sort of comparison between the big battery project, the lake storage project versus the building code scenarios and the improving your home stuff. And I feel like there's a lot of socialization that needs to be done to help people understand all these issues. And when you compare those two scenarios, I think one thing you can probably say is that we're all going to pay for it one way or another, right? Whether we pay for it in our taxes in some giant government funded scheme, or we pay for it individually to improve our households and stuff. So I'm just thinking that the next extension of the research might be to sort of think about those kind of the actual impact on at the household level of what those different choices would look like. So, and I suppose they would be like, they would cost us at different time periods, perhaps, and they would cost us in different ways. Like they would cost us out of higher taxes, with asking from businesses to do a lot of demand shifting. That might have productivity impacts potentially. And whereas the household stuff is mostly going to fall on independent households, so there might be other social support systems needed. So yeah, I'm thinking you might need to go into that next level of research to help socialize everybody to help make these decisions, because it seems like they're big decisions and it's hard to know which one's the right way to go. But thanks, really interesting.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. So the Green Building Council has done a little bit of work on this. And I guess the thing about household heating is, you know, I've just simplified it down to looking at peaks. Of course, the household heating thing is, you know, this is just a tiny tip of the iceberg around household heating. The health implications are just far outweigh anything that I've talked about here. So that needs to be taken into account in the analysis as well. You know, a dam built in Lake Onslow has no, you know, that's not going to do anything to your health.
Any questions from the room? Yeah.
My question about you talking about peaks of hot water boiler usage between the morning shower period. Is there much potential for in the technology of like preheated, thermally insulated hot water boilers to shift the peak into maybe the early hours of the morning? And like, where's the technology for that at the moment? Is it?
Yeah, so I guess my answer would be, yeah, there's huge potential. I guess it's a kind of interesting situation to me, because the hot water cylinder is kind of is an extremely cheap device that you have in your home. But one interesting thing is that they put the inlet to the hot water cylinder, they put the thermostat where the inlet is. So, and this is how they're all built. So the cold water comes in and the thermostat immediately turns on. Now, it doesn't need to. You've got a full tank of hot water that's probably going to come out in a sort of thermally stratified way. So why, you know, it's just built out like that for to be cheap. And so it's more a question of, yeah, could we build just a slightly smarter hot water cylinder for slightly more cost and get all these benefits from it? Yeah, and huge potential, I would say, for controlling that. And yeah, I don't really understand why I mean, there are people working on smart hot water cylinders, but these tend to be maybe a little bit too sophisticated. And so maybe there's somewhere in between where it's just a low cost option. Yeah.
Where do you put the most hope in solving the problem? Personal, private business, or government?
Which problem?
The problem, right?
The whole problem.
Yeah. And with a local focus, really.
Well, I think the trouble with New Zealand government, so maybe a bit provocative here, is the inconsistency of the messaging more than anything. You know, the last government said electric vehicles are good. And there were incentives in place, but I would say it's more the messaging electric vehicles are good that led to the huge uptake. This current government says electric, we're not even going to mention electric vehicles. Let's find some more gas. It's that inconsistency of messaging that, I mean, if you want to do what Australia did, that takes time. It takes a decade or more of consistent kind of messaging, consistent support for one thing. And I think that the trouble with the New Zealand government is it flip-flops between things. And, whenever we elect a new government, they try and get rid of what the last government said. And I think that's the problem. We need sort of cross-party consistency in what they're planning to do about. It's the problem's too big for that sort of playing around with the policy settings. So I mean, solving it. I think there's a lot of
low hope there for the other.
Yeah, so I think on the other hand, businesses are really conscious about greenhouse gas emissions. That is very high on the agenda. And so I actually putting more hope in businesses right at the moment to kind of think about this, but they need a bit of certainty, and the government needs to provide that sort of certainty, and then the investment happens. It's the same with investment in new wind, new solar. We all know that we're gonna, if we're going on this trajectory, that we need to invest now, not in 10 years' time. But there's lack of assurance that means that the kind of investment doesn't happen. So so two things: the government surety of messaging, and then I think that the industry will follow in terms of investment.
The other thing that's actually going to be a lot better off, while it's an investment now, it's a huge saving.
Yeah, so this has been proven over and over again, by multiple levels of analysis.
For individuals at home as well as industry.
So one last point on that. The trouble, I guess, on the individual side is you can get a lot of discrepancy. So you can get a lot of inequality happening because you invest in solar PV, invest in batteries, you get an EV, I'm sorted. But it means that the haves have very different situations than the don't haves. They don't have, they still have to use their gas for heating or whatever, because they don't have the capital available to make these changes. So even when things are cheaper, but often it's the capital cost. So I think sustainable finance is actually a really important thing to come in there, where loans are given to people and then they pay them off over the lifetime. That sustainable finance piece, I think, is really critical.
Great, and I think we're out of time, but that was a good question to end it on. So please join me in thanking Michael. I think once again highlighted that we're talking about a future energy system, and too often the spotlight shines on the supply side and we lose sight of the huge potential on the demand side and flexibility. So thanks very much.